There are griefs that have names, and there are griefs that do not. When someone dies, the world has a vocabulary for what you are going through. People use words like loss, mourning, condolences. They bring food, they sit beside you, they send cards. They understand, without needing to be told, that something in your life has broken open and will take time to close. There is a ritual for it. There is a social structure that holds you while you go through it, that tells you what to do next, that acknowledges the weight of what you are carrying. But there is another kind of grief, quieter, less recognized, and for many people, more persistent than the grief that follows death. It is the grief of the relationship that did not end cleanly. The friendship that faded over years until one day you realized you had not spoken in 3, and then 5, and then you lost count. The sibling you no longer speak to, not because of anything that could be called a final break, but because of something smaller that accumulated into something permanent. The parent you spent decades trying to understand, and whom you never quite reached, and who is now gone or very old, and the reaching is no longer possible in the same way. The adult child who pulled away slowly and then completely, who now lives a full life you are not part of, whose birthday you still know, whose face you can still picture exactly, and who does not call. This grief has no funeral. Nobody sends a card. Nobody asks how you are coping. The world does not pause for it, because to the world, nothing happened. The person is still alive. The relationship technically exists, somewhere. It is simply unreachable, or unresolved, or suspended in a silence that neither side seems willing or able to break. And yet it weighs on people. For many, it weighs more than any formal loss they have experienced. Because formal loss, for all its pain, at least has a shape. It has a before and an after. It has a reason. People understand it, but the grief of an unfinished relationship has none of those things. It has only the unresolved question, hovering quietly in the background of a life, not shouting, not demanding, but present, the way a draft from under a door is present. You do not always notice it directly, but you feel it constantly, in a diffuse and tiring way. There is a particular feature of this kind of grief that distinguishes it from others. It is not only the loss that hurts, it is the incompleteness. A relationship that ended, even badly, even unfairly, even painfully, has a kind of shape to it. It happened. It is finished. You can orient yourself around it, as you would orient yourself around any fact of your life. But an unfinished relationship has no shape. It is a story interrupted mid-sentence. You are still in it, in some sense. It still occupies a part of your inner life, still surfaces in dreams, still arrives uninvited when a particular song plays or a smell triggers something or you pass through a neighborhood you associate with that person. But you cannot move within it, and you cannot close it. The philosopher Paul Ricoeur, writing about how the self is constituted through narrative, observed that we are shaped not only by the stories we have lived but by the ones we have not been able to finish. Unfinished narratives carry a particular kind of charge. They remain active in the psyche in ways that completed stories, even difficult ones, do not. This is not a mystical claim. It is simply a description of how the mind handles incompletion. It keeps returning to it. It keeps circling the open question, looking for a resolution that has not arrived. Most people who carry an unfinished relationship do not need a philosopher to explain this to them. They already know it. They know it in the way they sometimes find themselves rehearsing a conversation with someone they have not spoken to in years. They know it in the way a family gathering approaches and something in them tightens at the thought of the subject that will not be raised, the person whose name will be avoided, the questions everyone knows are there and no one will ask. They know it in the way that particular kind of grief, formless, nameless, without social ritual, sits in a different part of the body than ordinary sadness. It is worth noting how common this is, even if it does not feel common. Research on family estrangement, which is only one form of the unfinished relationship, and not even the most prevalent, suggests that somewhere between a quarter and a third of adults in Western countries are estranged from at least one family member at any given time. That is not a marginal phenomenon. That is an ordinary feature of modern family life that almost nobody talks about openly, because the shame of it is too personal and the social language for it is too thin. And beyond formal estrangement, there are far more people who carry the quieter, unnamed versions of the unfinished relationship. The friendship that simply dissolved, the colleague who meant a great deal once and is now a name without a connection, the mentor whose influence shaped a life and who was never thanked properly, the parent or sibling or child with whom something important was never said and the opportunity has not yet closed but feels smaller than it once did. Today, we are going to talk about this kind of grief. Not because there is a simple answer. Not because there is always a path back. Not because every unfinished relationship can or should be resolved. But because this particular weight deserves to be examined carefully and spoken about honestly. Because many people carry it in silence, without the language to name it, without the social permission to mourn it, and without realizing how common it is, or how much of their quiet energy it consumes. To understand why so many people today carry unfinished relationships, it helps to step back and ask what changed in the world that made this kind of incompletion more likely. People have always had difficult relationships. People have always found reasons to drift apart, to fall into conflict, to leave things unsaid. That part is not new. What is different is the structural ease with which a relationship can now be left unfinished indefinitely, quietly, without drama, without a declared ending, simply by not doing the small things that keep a connection alive. A generation ago, the conditions of ordinary life made it harder for relationships to drift into permanent silence. Not because people were more emotionally skilled, or more courageous about difficult conversations, or kinder than people are now. But because geography, routine, and the structure of shared community kept people in proximity. And proximity creates friction, yes. But friction also creates resolution. You cannot easily leave a conversation permanently unfinished when you will see that person at church on Sunday, or at the same block party every summer, or at the family gathering that happens whether you wanted to or not, or at the neighbor's kitchen table every Tuesday. The structure of the shared life did the work of maintenance, even when no one was consciously doing it. Modern life quietly dissolved those structures. Families moved apart. Children left for distant cities, and then for other countries. The extended family that once lived within a few streets, the cousins, the aunts, the grandparents nearby, scattered across states and continents. What had been a daily or weekly presence became an annual visit, then a Christmas phone call, then a message on a birthday that might or might not receive a reply, and then silence. Not hostile silence, not a declared break, simply the silence of a connection that no longer had a structure holding it in place. When the scaffolding of shared community disappeared, the relationships that had depended on it for their survival were left exposed. And it turned out that many relationships had been held together more by proximity than by intention. When the proximity ended, the intention was not always enough. At the same time, the way people communicate changed in ways that compounded this problem in a particularly modern and unexpected way. The rise of social media gave people a form of contact that looks like connection but may actually make the avoidance of genuine contact easier. You can follow someone's life for years without ever speaking to them. You can know that your estranged cousin had a grandchild, that your old friend moved house, that the person you once knew best in the world seems to be doing well, or seems to be struggling, and none of this knowledge requires you to make contact. It requires nothing from you at all. You can watch a life from a distance, holding the technical possibility of contact without ever exercising it, and this watching can become a substitute for the actual relationship that you can no longer bring yourself to attempt. There is something particular about seeing someone's life and not being part of it. It has its own texture. It is different from simply not knowing anything about them. The knowing, the small, regular glimpses of their continued existence, keeps the question of the unfinished relationship very much alive, while at the same time offering enough information to make the reaching out feel strange. You know too much to act like a stranger. You are too distant to act like someone who belongs in their life. You exist in an uncomfortable in-between, and the in-between becomes the permanent arrangement. There is also something to say about the generational emotional cultures that set up many of these situations in the first place. The generation that raised the current population of adults aged 55 to 75 was not, for the most part, an emotionally expressive generation. They were people formed by the Depression, by war, by privation, by a code of conduct that said you did not speak about what hurt you, you did not discuss feelings at the dinner table, you did not tell your children you were proud of them because they would know, you did not apologize because apology was weakness, and you did not reach toward people who had hurt you because that would be giving something away. That silence was not cruelty. It was often the only emotional language those people knew. But it set up a pattern. It meant that many of the conversations that needed to happen, between parents and adult children, between siblings, between old friends after a conflict, never happened. Not because people did not feel things, but because the cultural infrastructure for expressing them was not there. And then, more recently, another change arrived. The rise of what some researchers call the therapeutic culture brought, alongside many genuine benefits, a language of self-protection. The idea that it is legitimate, even necessary, to remove yourself from relationships that cause you pain. To establish boundaries. To cut off contact with people who are harmful to your well-being. These ideas are not wrong. Some relationships are genuinely harmful, and the ability to name that and step back is a real and important freedom. But a language, once available, gets used in many different situations, including ones it was not originally meant for. The permission to protect one's peace can be applied with wisdom, and it can also be applied too quickly, to situations that were not toxic so much as difficult. And difficult relationships, if they are handled with care, often become the most important ones in a life. The question worth sitting with is whether the distance came from genuine necessity or simply from the fact that the work of repair felt too large, and the language of self-protection made it easier to decline. There is a particular quality to the weight of an unfinished relationship that distinguishes it from ordinary sadness. Ordinary sadness tends to move. It rises and falls. It responds to circumstances. It tends, over time, to diminish. But the weight of an unfinished relationship does not behave this way. It does not diminish in the way that other griefs diminish. Instead, it resurfaces. A person might go weeks or even months without consciously thinking about the estranged sibling, or the drifted friend, or the parent with whom something crucial was never said. And then something arrives. A photograph in a box, a mutual acquaintance mentioning a name casually, a birthday on the calendar. A song from the years when the relationship was alive. And suddenly the whole unresolved weight of it is present again. As if no time had passed. As if the years of not thinking about it had done nothing at all. Psychologists sometimes call this a recurring intrusion. The mind keeps returning to an unfinished relationship because the relationship has not given the mind an endpoint around which to organize its understanding. There is no closing event. There is no final chapter. And so the mind continues to circle the open question, to rehearse the conversation that was never had, to replay the moment things change, looking for a resolution that has not arrived and may never arrive. This is not a flaw in the person who experiences it. It is simply what the mind does with incompletion. This is one reason why people who carry multiple unfinished relationships often describe a vague but persistent sense of something unresolved in their lives, not sharp grief, but something more like background noise. An ambient unease. A faint, continuous hum beneath the surface of daily life that never fully quiets, even when everything is fine on the surface. The cost shows up in ways that are often invisible to others. It shapes how people move through family events. The holiday gathering that should be pleasant becomes shadowed by the name that will not be spoken. The subject everyone knows is there but no one will raise. The careful way sentences are structured to avoid the edge of the territory. Everyone at the table has agreed, without a single discussion, on the geography of what can and cannot be said. And maintaining that collective agreement requires a specific kind of energy, a vigilance, a self-editing, a small and ongoing suppression, that adds a layer of exhaustion to events that were supposed to be restorative. It shapes how people think about the future. Many people in the second half of life carry a quiet, low-grade dread about what will happen when an aging parent dies and the estranged sibling will need to be contacted. Or when a family estate becomes a matter of legal record and the unspoken things suddenly have financial dimensions. Or when a diagnosis arrives and the window that had always seemed open begins visibly to close. There is a form of anticipatory grief in carrying this, the knowledge that a reckoning is coming, that the avoidance is finite, that time will eventually force the conversation that no one chose to have voluntarily. Consider what happens in the weeks before a major holiday when a family is carrying one of these silences. There are conversations that happen in advance, among the people who will be present, about how to manage the absence. Someone will say, "Let's just not bring it up," and everyone will agree. And then the day will arrive, and the food will be made, and the conversation will be careful, and there will be moments when someone almost says the name and then catches themselves, and the catching is visible even if the name was not said. Children, who notice everything, pick up on the geometry of the avoidance without being told what it is. They understand that something is missing. They do not always understand what. And the adults at the table, who are working hard to keep the occasion pleasant, end the day more tired than they expected. This is the ordinary cost. Not dramatic, not a scene, simply the sustained effort of a gathering organized around an absence, and the exhaustion that belongs to anything that requires that kind of vigilance. It also affects how people understand and narrate themselves. When a relationship ends in a clear and understandable way, you can still construct a coherent story about who you were in that relationship and what happened. It may be painful, but it has a shape. You can place it in your life. But when a relationship is simply unfinished, when it exists in ambiguity, the self-narrative has gaps that are harder to account for. And those gaps can become quiet sources of shame. The question underneath most unfinished relationships is, what does this say about me? What does it say about me that my brother and I no longer speak? What does it say about me that I let a 30-year friendship dissolve without making a real effort to save it? What does it say about me that I never told my father what I needed to tell him, and now he is very old, or gone, and the telling is no longer possible in the same way? People ask these questions inwardly and rarely share them, because the asking already involves an exposure they are not ready for. The shame of an unfinished relationship is often not the result of having done something terrible. It is more often the shame of incompletion itself. The sense that a person who was fully in command of themselves would have handled this differently, would have reached out sooner, would have found the words. The researcher Pauline Boss developed the concept of ambiguous loss to describe a particular kind of grief that has no clear resolution, where the person who is lost is simultaneously present and absent. She developed this concept first to describe the experience of families of soldiers missing in action, or of people living with dementia, where someone's physical and psychological presences had become misaligned. But she later wrote about the ways the concept applies more broadly, to estrangement, to immigration, to the quiet disappearances that do not announce themselves but leave the same particular kind of unresolved grief. Ambiguous loss, Boss observed, is one of the most difficult kinds of grief to process, precisely because it offers no clear invitation to mourn. The person is still there, somewhere. The relationship still exists, technically. There is no event to mark, no grave to visit, no socially sanctioned permission to grieve what has been lost. And so it goes unprocessed. It sits, it resurfaces, and the person carrying it often feels that they should be further along by now, more resolved, more at peace, without quite understanding why the peace refuses to arrive. There is a harder question underneath all of this, and it is worth sitting with it carefully. Why do people leave relationships unfinished? Not out of indifference. That is rarely the explanation. The people who carry unfinished relationships the heaviest are often the people who cared the most. The weight itself is evidence of caring. If the relationship had not mattered, the silence would have been easy, and the years would have moved through it without leaving a mark. The more uncomfortable answer, the answer that is worth sitting with even when it is not entirely comfortable, is this. We leave relationships unfinished because approaching them honestly requires a kind of vulnerability that most people find genuinely difficult. And the conditions of that vulnerability are specific and real. To reach towards someone you have been estranged from, or with whom something important was never said, is to expose yourself to the possibility that they do not want to be reached. That they have moved on, or that they are relieved by the distance, or that they will say something that clarifies the loss in a way that the ambiguity had been protecting you from. It is to expose yourself to the possibility that your version of events is not the only version, or not the complete version. And it is sometimes to expose yourself to the possibility that you caused pain, and that you will have to sit with someone's account of that pain and not defend yourself. These are not small risks. They are real ones, and the fear of them is entirely rational. But there is another fear that sits alongside this one, and it is subtler, and in some ways more paralyzing. It is the fear that approaching the unfinished relationship will not change anything. That the conversation will happen, and it will resolve nothing. That the time was too long, or the damage too deep, or the other person too different from who they were, or too defended, and that the reaching out will serve only to confirm, formally, that there is nothing left to reach toward. This fear is different from the fear of rejection. The fear of rejection is a fear of what the other person will do in response to your approach. But the fear of confirmed loss is a fear of clarity, of having the open question answered in the worst possible way. Because while the relationship remains technically unfinished, while you have not reached out and been turned away, it remains, in some sense, possible. The door is not confirmed shut. It is simply not opened. And an unopened door can become, over years, a kind of quiet comfort. Not a real comfort, not a satisfying one, but a small and significant protection against the finality of knowing. The philosopher Albert Camus wrote about the human tendency to live with what he called the absurd, the gap between the self's need for clarity and the world's refusal to provide it. His observation was not that people were irrational for refusing full clarity. It was that the refusal is deeply understandable, and that it requires honesty to see it for what it is. Many unfinished relationships live in exactly this space. The person carrying the unfinished relationship is not oblivious to it. They know it is there. They think about it more often than they admit. But they have arranged their life around its continued presence, and the arrangement has a logic to it, even if that logic is the logic of avoidance. There is also something worth examining in how people assign responsibility in unfinished relationships. One of the most common things people say is, "It is not my place to reach out. I was not the one who caused the distance. They pulled away first, or they said the thing that started this, or they made the decision that broke it. It is for them to come back." This is a legitimate position, and in some situations it is entirely correct. There are estrangements where one party caused genuine harm, and where the expectation that the harmed party should reach out first is itself a form of injustice. That is real, and it deserves acknowledgement. But it is worth asking an honest secondary question alongside the principled one. Is the principled position producing the outcome you actually want? Or has it quietly become a permanent arrangement, a life organized around an absence, that nobody consciously chose and that the principle is now serving to maintain? Because principles, held long enough, become habits. And habits, held long enough, become the background conditions of a life that feel like facts rather than choices. The principled weight that begins as a statement of legitimate grievance can become, over a decade or 2 decades, simply the way things are. And the way things are was never formally chosen by anyone. It accreted, it settled, it became the shape of the family, the shape of the friendship, the shape of something that might have been. There is also something to be said about the question of mutual injury. Most estrangements do not have a clean moral architecture. One side is not entirely innocent and the other entirely guilty. There is usually more distributed than that, a series of misunderstandings, a wound that was never acknowledged, a response that went too far, a silence that hardened into something it was never meant to be. The clarity of assigning blame is, in most cases, a partial clarity at best. And clinging to a partial clarity as though it were the full picture can be one of the things that keeps the door closed. What people who have managed to return to long estrangements describe, when they describe it honestly, is striking. It is not that the conversation went perfectly. It is not that everything was resolved. It is not that the relationship became what it once was. Often none of those things happened. What they describe is that the returning itself, the act of approaching the unfinished thing with honesty and without a guarantee, removed a specific kind of weight that had been present for so long it had become part of the texture of ordinary life. They had not known how much of themselves was organized around that absence until they were no longer organizing around it. George Eliot wrote, at the close of Middlemarch, about the growing good of the world depending on unhistoric acts. On the small things done by people who chose to act rightly in ordinary moments, without recognition, without record, without applause. The repair of a relationship is almost always an unhistoric act. Nobody marks it, nobody awards it. It happens in a phone call, or a letter, or a doorstep, or a table where two people sit down with something difficult between them and decide, quietly, to try. There is no clean answer to this subject, and offering one would be dishonest. Some unfinished relationships will never be finished. Some of them should not be. The other person may have died, or may be genuinely unreachable, or may be someone whose presence in your life caused real harm, and the distance that followed was the right and necessary choice even if it still carries its own particular grief. Not every silence is a mistake. Not every door was closed by accident. Some were closed carefully, by someone who had good reason to close them, and the peace that followed the closing was real and earned and should not be questioned. These distinctions matter, and anyone engaging seriously with this question has to begin by making them honestly. The grief of a necessary estrangement is different from the grief of an unnecessary one, even if both are real, and even if both are carried for a long time. But there is a third category that deserves its own examination. It is the category of the relationship that is not finished because of genuine harm, and not finished because of a conscious and examined choice, but simply because nobody moved. Because the silence arrived and nobody broke it. Because reaching out felt risky and the risk felt too large, and so the reaching was deferred, and then deferred again, until the deferral became the default, and the default became the arrangement, and the arrangement became so familiar that it began to feel like a decision that had been made. In that category, the honest question is, what are you actually choosing? Not what happened, and not whose fault it was, and not who should reach out first. But what are you, right now, choosing to do with this thing you have been carrying? What would you want, if you allowed yourself to want something? Not a guarantee, not a perfect outcome, but a direction. There is a useful distinction between forgiveness and reconciliation that often gets collapsed together in ways that make both harder. Forgiveness is something a person does inside themselves, and it can be done alone. It does not require the other person's participation, or agreement, or even awareness. It is the act of releasing the grip on a resentment, not because the resentment was unjustified, but because the holding of it is costing you more than the releasing will. Forgiveness of this kind is not absolution. It does not say that what happened was acceptable. It says that you are choosing not to continue organizing your inner life around it. Reconciliation is different. It requires two people. It requires the other person to show up, and to engage, and to be willing to do some of the same work. It cannot be willed into existence by one party alone. And this is one of the genuine limits of the situation. You can decide to approach. You can decide what to say and how to say it and what you are hoping for. But you cannot decide how it will be received. What you can decide is whether to go. Whether to write the letter or make the call or appear on the doorstep. Whether to offer the thing you have been holding, not with a guarantee of acceptance, not with a script for how the conversation should unfold, but simply as an honest offering, from where you are now, to where they are. People who have done this describe something that is not quite what they expected. The conversation is often awkward. The reunion is often smaller than the imagination prepared for. The wound does not disappear. But something does shift. A weight that had been so present for so long that it was invisible becomes, briefly, visible, and in the visibility, somewhat lighter. The relationship may not be repaired, but the person who reached was changed by the reaching. The ancient teacher Hillel offered a question that has stayed alive for more than 2,000 years, perhaps because it touches something that does not age. If not now, when? He was not giving an instruction. He was asking a question. And it is worth putting that question quietly to the unfinished relationships in your own life, not urgently, not with panic, but with the kind of honest attention you might give to something you have been putting down every morning for years, telling yourself you will pick it up later. Because the window does not always stay open as long as we assume it will. Not because of dramatic events, but because of the ordinary passage of time, which does its work quietly, which does not announce its progress, and which does not wait for us to feel ready. Parents become very old. Old friends move into the final chapters of their health. The person you once knew as young and capable becomes someone different, someone smaller in some ways, someone for whom the time for certain conversations is genuinely running short. This is not meant to frighten. It is meant to be honest. The point is not that every unfinished relationship must be finished. It is not that you owe reconciliation to people who were not safe. It is not that the risk is never too large, or that every conversation will produce something valuable. The point is simpler than that. It is that most of the relationships people carry as unfinished were not ended intentionally, and have not been examined honestly, and are continuing in their current state not because of a considered choice but because the silence has its own momentum, and momentum is not the same as wisdom. What does the actual act of reaching look like, in practice? It does not need to be large. It does not require a prepared speech, or a list of grievances, or a demand for acknowledgement. It often begins with something smaller than that, an acknowledgement that time has passed, that you think about them, that something between you was left unfinished and that you would like to try, not with a guarantee, but because the alternative has begun to feel like its own kind of loss. Sometimes a letter is easier than a phone call. The written word gives both people room. It allows the person who receives it to read it more than once, to sit with it, to respond from a place of consideration rather than reaction. It does not demand an immediate answer. And it has a permanence that a conversation does not. The person who receives it knows that you sat down deliberately, that you chose the words, that this was not an impulse but an intention. Whatever form the reaching takes, the quality that seems to matter most is not eloquence or completeness. It is honesty. The willingness to say, I do not know exactly how to do this, and I am not certain how it will be received, but I am choosing to try. That honesty, offered without manipulation or hidden agenda, tends to land differently than a carefully constructed argument. It tends to remind both people that underneath the history and the silence, there are two people who once knew each other, and perhaps still do. What we owe is not reconciliation. What we owe is clarity. Clarity about what we are choosing, and why, and whether the choice we are living with is actually the one we would make if we looked at it directly. And sometimes, when people do look at it directly, they find something they did not expect. They find that the fear was always larger than the thing itself. That the approach was always more possible than it seemed. That the person they had been carrying, all this time, in the background of their life, had been carrying them too.